Welcome to episode 14 of the G2 and 5G, the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel and Will. So let's get started with my first topic. This week, Deutsche Telekom provided an update on their 5G deployment and coverage of Germany. And I find it pretty impressive. They had a very aggressive goal to cover half of the population by mid-year. They've achieved that. And they're projecting that by the end of 2020, they'll have over 3/4 of the country's citizenship covered by 5G. And I don't know if, from your perspective, Anshel, but I think that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I think considering the size of Germany, that's a very ambitious goal to achieve. And if you look at the size of Deutsche Telekom, they're a very large company.
Mm-hmm.
So this would have had to have been a multi-year planning effort to make this possible.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. And, they are quite large. And I'm also impressed with, they're one of the few carriers, and I spoke to this in a Forbes article mid last year, focusing on use case. And, private networking has been a big focus of theirs. I think they've had some announcements around that activity. And so, yeah, it just proves that it isn't just about the access, it's actually about the use case from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think also probably helped that they had some buy-in from the government, because, getting the spectrum freed up where you need it and getting the permits that you need, if you need to add more sites, it's definitely a cooperative kind of approach.
Yeah, and, they've been very vocal in the past around putting some controls on these spectrum auctions, because as we know, these auctions, like they kind of, from my perspective, spin up and generate billions and billions of revenue. And then, then the operators have to deploy the infrastructure, which is billions and billions on top of that. And so, it's a quite interesting dynamic, but it'll be interesting to see how they track to that goal of, getting 3/4 of that coverage by the end of the year. But let's shift to your first topic. And Qualcomm announced earnings this week, correct?
Yeah,
And
so
Apple.
actually,
Yeah.
yesterday, Qualcomm announced earnings, and today Apple announced earnings. And yesterday, Qualcomm kind of alluded to the fact that one of their biggest 5G customers may be delayed in launching their 5G devices. And they wouldn't have made such an announcement unless it was a pretty big customer, which would either be a Samsung or an Apple, because Apple is moving back to Qualcomm modems with 5G. And the first Apple 5G phone is expected to come out this fall. But there have been some things that we've actually talked about on this podcast about the possibility that there might be a delay in the iPhone due to COVID-19 and due to, the way, the development cycle works. And then today, during Apple's earnings, they actually confirmed that the new iPhone will be delayed by a few weeks due to, no surprise, COVID-19.
Yeah.
And I think it's mostly Apple has to have engineers monitoring the bring up of these devices. And it looks like they were able to figure out how to resolve these issues without having their engineers in China or Taiwan or in Korea, and able to get things working remotely, from the US. But obviously it caused some delays, and there were probably some components that were also delayed. And as a result, they've got a delay, which is not a huge surprise. But having a 5G iPhone, I think, is still a big deal, because at least in the US, it's going to drive a lot more demand for 5G infrastructure and experiences.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the footprint of the iPhone is unquestionable. I'm an iPhone user as well, and I cover infrastructure. You really cover the end devices. I'm curious. So I knew that Apple was going to, they resolved their IP, dispute with Qualcomm. I thought the original, the initial plan was to fall back to Qualcomm, but that given Apple's acquisition of the Intel modem division, that long term they're going to develop their own 5G modems. Is that still the case?
Yeah, that's still the case. Basically, even if you acquire somebody's modem IP, unless you just continue their development cycle, which arguably was not satisfactory to Intel's demands, which means they wouldn't continue that development cycle,
Yeah.
They would need to start from fresh, from new.
Right.
And that's about a 3 to 5 year process. So
Right.
realistically, we won't see an Apple modem probably for another 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they could have come to market with an Intel 5G modem. It existed, but they kept hitting delays. They kept having issues, and as a result, they switched to Qualcomm and delayed the potential of a 5G phone for a year.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. In a former life, I did product marketing, and yeah, I mean, these roadmaps, it's not a flip of the switch. It takes quite a bit of engineering work, and Apple has historically been, obviously they're a closed ecosystem, not very, they are a closed ecosystem. So they want to control very tightly, not only the software stack, but the hardware stack as well. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out. Let's hit my second topic this week. And I've been a big advocate of CBRS and the democratization of spectrum. And the PAL auction launched, and initially it's generated over $500 million. I know you're going to talk about the T-Mobile analyst call that we were both on earlier today. T-Mobile couldn't comment on CBRS because they were also participating in the auction. But what I find very compelling about the PAL is that it's giving opportunities to enterprises and school districts and hospitals access to licensed spectrum, so they can deploy these, initially LTE and eventually 5G private networks. And I really believe that it's going to be very disruptive, and it's going to really kind of accelerate that whole adoption. Do you have any thoughts on that subject?
I think the whole CBRS and PAL auction situation is kind of convoluted.
Mm-hmm.
I think it adds complexity to the spectrum landscape, but it also gives people access to spectrum where they couldn't get it before.
Right.
Because because CBRS is a more shared band.
Right.
It adds complexity to the radio environment. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it will add cost in some scenarios. But I also think that it will give access in places where it just wasn't possible.
I agree. And Apple supports that spectrum with their current iPhone solution, Samsung as well. So from a device perspective, it's ready. I agree with you. It's going to introduce complexity, and OnGo Wireless was formed to try to manage that complexity and provide a very easy way, not only to manage and facilitate the auction of all of this, but to help with the deployment, because you're going to have enterprises that are very capable, like the larger automobile manufacturers, that are going to want to implement it for factory automation, but then there'll be others that will need a managed service provider, like a Federated Wireless that I think I've spoken to in the past, that'll be able to provide that capability. So it'll be interesting how that all rolls out. But so let's segue into that T-Mobile analyst call. We were, it was quite long. It was an hour with 30 minutes of Q&A. Neville Ray was on. John Saw, the former CTO of Sprint, who I have a lot of respect for, is on the executive team. Neville now is president of the technology division, and it was fun, for John to give me a shout out on the call as he focuses on emerging technology. But let me let you take it. It's your topic. What were your impressions from the call?
Yeah, I was gonna say that I think it was really good that they gave a lot of good details on SA. I think the majority of the call was pretty much focused on standalone,
Right.
and also showing how they're going to deploy 2.5 gigahertz. So I think the two big takeaways were, that they're doing 2,000 sites per month now between 600 and 2.5 gigahertz, which is insane.
Right.
And that pace obviously will eventually slow, or maybe even speed up and then slow down. But it's really amazing that they've committed so aggressively to getting so many sites up and going. And I think, them showing how they're also increasing the speeds of 2.5, where currently it's 300 megabits per second, but by the end of the year, they'll be able to get 400 megabits per second with the same amount of bandwidth. In theory, maybe they're actually freeing up more bandwidth. That might actually be what it is. But
Right.
I think it's just amazing that they're going to be able to pull an average of 400 megabits per second. because the reality is we've already seen in some early tests that 2.5 gigahertz does north of a gig when you have enough bandwidth.
Yeah.
So I think it's really promising. They're really hammering home the SA stuff, especially saying that they might be the first ones in the world,
To have
unless
standalone.
somebody decides to do a very small deployment and undercut them. But I think they'll probably be the first ones with a nationwide deployment. And it's just fascinating how fast and rapid they've been with getting their 5G network up and running and deployed and getting coverage. I think it's, their claims of being ahead of the competition, I think are somewhat valid, especially when you consider that, they're way ahead of both their competitors in coverage, and their LTE speeds are still pretty solid.
Right.
And 5G average speeds are still pretty decent. Admittedly, they're not much better than LTE, but I think those will change vastly as 2.5 rolls out.
Yeah, and as SA rolls out, and two of my big takeaways were Neville spoke to the fact that there's been a lot of hype around 5G, but this is the speed improvement is big time. It's 10x, right? So moving from 40 to 400, that's going to unlock a number of transformative use cases, both for consumer and enterprise. I would have liked to have seen Neville and the team speak more to what they're going to do with business and with the assets that Sprint brings, because T-Mobile's been a very consumer-focused company. They've been very disruptive there. Light on the enterprise services. Sprint brings a lot of capabilities. They've launched their Curiosity IoT network, headed up by Eva Rook, and they've been delivering kind of repackaged SD-WAN services and those sorts of things. So I think that's important. And the other thing that really struck me as impressive, and you and I have written about this, we both wrote an article together on the whole layer cake. And for those of our viewers that don't know what that means, it's this whole notion of, with Sprint and T-Mobile coming together post-merger, they have a very compelling spectrum footprint. They've got low band, mid band, and high band, and that's what's going to allow them ultimately to deliver ubiquity with a 5G network. Millimeter wave in urban areas, it requires lots of densification, but to serve the broader audiences, albeit at slightly lower speeds with that low and mid band.
The other thing I was going to say is I would have liked to maybe see more commitments to latencies, like actual latency,
Right.
or maybe get some figures on what their real latency is like. I guess we'll find out soon, but maybe they're just tightening it up and waiting until they actually launch the network to give latency, because ultimately latency is one of the big benefits of 5G, especially with standalone. And they said that they had to rip out their core and put a new core in to be able to do SA. So yeah, I'm very excited to see where this goes, and they're definitely paving the way in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I agree with you. Latency, from my perspective, we've both written about it on Forbes, but it's the game changer. You get under 5 milliseconds, and then you're enabling crazy use cases like real-time streaming video that can be responded to. That's what's going to support autonomous driving and vehicles, and just unlock a whole host of just very disruptive use cases. So it'll be interesting to keep our eyes on T-Mobile and share our insight and input as we see that mature and grow with T-Mobile. So let's hit my third topic this week. And I've written about satellite, and there's been a space race around low orbit, and OneWeb was the leader. Tesla has come out and they want to provide low orbit satellite capabilities to be able to provide broadband and rural areas and that sort of thing. And it's no secret, OneWeb has had some hard economic times. They declared bankruptcy. This week it was announced there's a consortium that's been put together that is going to try to resurrect OneWeb, because they did a lot of work. They were years ahead of Tesla and even I think Dish's.
You mean SpaceX, right?
SpaceX. What was I saying?
Yeah, you were saying Tesla.
Tesla. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Starlink, right?
I've got Elon Musk on the mind, right? So yeah, SpaceX. So that's encouraging, because I believe that low orbit satellite will take some time. That can serve potentially as future backhaul for 5G. And think about it, autonomous driving. If you're on autopilot and you're in a city, that's fine. It's blanketed with coverage and density. But if you're driving out to the farm, what happens? You've got to grab the steering wheel there. And so Hughes, obviously Hughes Satellite, they've been the terrestrial leader in providing that coverage. they've committed $50 million to helping resurrect this with this consortium. So, I mean, I mean, have you been following that at all? And do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I've been following a little bit. And yeah, I think they I mean, there was a lot of money invested. I think SoftBank was an investor in
They
OneWeb.
were. It was a SoftBank
Um,
portfolio company. You're right.
so I think they lost their pants on that one.
Right.
Like many other investments, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you look at the way they were doing things, it looked like they had good intentions.
Yeah.
And I think that, someone should resurrect what they're doing. That said, Starlink is very aggressively deploying their network as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because, SpaceX and Starlink, it's the same company. It's just their product name.
Right.
But I think there are also some concerns about these low Earth orbit networks because they are pretty dense,
Yeah.
and they are starting to become an issue because I don't know if you saw some photos of the comet, but there was one photo where someone took a picture of the comet and the Starlink satellites created a streak across the sky and kind of
Wow.
created like a mesh that like obstructed the night sky. So there are definitely some issues with these low orbit satellites that we may not have actually dealt with yet. So I'm curious to see how that happens in the future and whether the stargazing community and the astronomy community start to push back on it, because it might actually affect their ability to see the stars. So it's a different, separate issue, but it still affects OneWeb, I think.
Did you get a picture of that? I know you're a photographer.
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Not a good one, but I did get a picture.
Yeah, we should share that with the audience. So let's hit the last topic. It's your topic, and you are our resident AR, VR, mixed reality guy, and you want to talk about OpenXR.
Yeah, so just a quick kind of wrap up. I wrote an article in Forbes about it today. But back on Tuesday, they announced basically like it's been a year since they created the standard, and they have a lot of momentum from Microsoft and from Facebook. They actually got both the Oculus Quest and the Microsoft HoloLens certified, among other headsets. And basically, they're getting a lot of traction. The new Minecraft engine is actually going to support OpenXR as well, so you can play it in VR if you want to. And the other thing is that they talked about 5G and how OpenXR now standardizes the way that sensor data is communicated from an XR headset to the edge compute that's sitting on the 5G network, so that when it sends these low latency sensor data, that the renderer on the edge compute can adjust based on head position or on movement and be able to quickly send that data back, render the proper head pose, and send it back to the headset with very minimal latency. So they've been working on basically reducing the latency of how they send this sensor data over to the edge so that it can be rendered quickly and sent back quickly, and so there isn't any sense of lag or VR sickness, and so that the user who has an AR or VR headset on, or XR in this case, would be completely unaware to the fact that they are rendering out an edge compute. Interesting.
So beyond performance, I mean, are there any benefits? I mean, will an open approach here lower potentially the price of headsets? I've got a very entry level product. I know that these things go very, very high end. So I mean, will there be any sort of effect on overall price? So what it would do is it would actually allow headset makers to put less processing in their headsets. So more processing can be done on the edge so that higher quality experiences can be achieved on devices that are lighter and thinner than they were in the previous generation, because less processing needs to be done on the headset and more can be offloaded to the edge. So you can do a really high quality, high polygon experience without having to render all of it on the device, because if you do it on the device, it gets hot. It needs a lot of processing power, it needs a lot of battery. But if you take those away, it's mostly kind of like a remote viewer. Now, that's not always going to be the case, and it's going to take a while for that to happen, but that's not possible unless you have a standard by which all headsets abide by and all infrastructure abides by. So I think it's a great thing to have. Yeah, and I would think also that that's going to allow these devices to shrink and get smaller.
Yeah.
And then, consumer is one thing, but then the application for enterprise, and even for like first responders, and I've heard of the use case. I think it was a Qualcomm, proof of concept where, a firefighter could wear a goggle and have all this overlay information as they enter a burning building, know where potential victims are based on heat mapping,
Yeah.
where other firefighters are,
That's the
hotspots.
golden eye.
Not to go through a certain door if there's fire behind it. So it could be very, very compelling.
Yeah, and the thing is, there's already some glasses out there that make that compromise, but there isn't edge compute to, prop them up
Exactly.
in a way to give them more graphical capabilities. So they basically just like smart glasses right now. But the idea is to get what a good pair of smart glasses look like to run like an AR headset with full both eyes and 3D.
Yeah, it'll be exciting to see what results from that in the future. So, hey, well, that wraps up another great episode this week. Why don't you take us home?
Sure. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to reach out to us on a specific subject around 5G they would like for us to cover in a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Willtown Tech, and I'm at Anshel on Twitter. So please have a great weekend, and please tune again next week. Thank you.